reading the text and so forth. So we're studying now Daniel 7. And we want to look first at its context. And the language of Daniel 7 is written in Chaldean, just as everything from chapter 2 through Daniel chapter 7 is written in Chaldean, which is very similar to the Hebrew. It uses the same letters, but they're not arranged in the same way. Just like Spanish and English and German use the same alphabet, but it's not the same language, sort of similar. So the scripture deals with the history of the Gentile world, but through the lens of Israel. So it makes sense that Daniel would write all of this in the common language of his time. Now the vision of chapter 7 is basically the same scene, or the same events as we find in chapter 2, but with a difference of idioms used. We find in Daniel chapter 2, the symbols are of the glory of the kingdoms and the strength or the diminishing strength and the diminishing value and the increasing strength of the nations, of the kingdoms. But in Daniel chapter 2, we see something very different. We see voracious beasts causing pain and turmoil in their rebellion against God. They are diverse, not unified. They are ugly and disturbing. Speaking of beasts, we have a visitor among us today. I don't know if the camera caught it, but we just had our mascot walk by, a tabby. But these beasts are hardly tabbies, hardly gentle. So in Daniel 7, 1 and 2, we have the first thing that's written here. What does it say in Daniel 7, 1 and 2? Who will like to read? Please.
In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea.
Okay, does anybody have, from your other classes and studies, do you have any idea when this vision was given? When does it say it was given?
The first year of Belshazzar.
First year of Belshazzar. When was the first year of Belshazzar?
That was...
Anybody know?
Yeah, I believe so. I think it's 56 BC. Sorry.
You got
56.
538.
Okay, let's take a look quickly at that date.
Yeah, you're right. It's 550 to 539 or something.
You're getting closer. You're working on it. Your brain's working on it. All right, let's look at that because we have who is Nabopolassar. Who is this?
The father of Nebuchadnezzar.
Father of Nebuchadnezzar. When did he rule?
650. I think.
Had to be before 606, right?
Yeah.
Okay. When was it? 606? Approximately 625 to 605 BC. Now you should remember these dates. We might just include them on a test, all right? Because these are pretty important people in the line of history. And then we have Nebuchadnezzar, right? A-D-N-E-Z-Z-A-R. So when did he rule?
From 606 to 570, approximately. No, it was about a 40-year reign, approximately.
Approximately correct.
Yeah.
Very good. Actually, a little bit more than 40 years. See, my notes say 604. 604 to 652 BC. Now this has to do with 604, has to do with his ruling after his father died, because his father died about 605. He actually was ruling jointly with his father for about 3 or 4 years that we know, maybe longer. So when his father died, Jerusalem had fallen. He had taken some captives there. And so what happened was he left. He went across the desert, as we mentioned before, and went straight home to his father's funeral. So this has to do with the date that he ruled without his father. Then there is Evil Merodach. Have you heard of him? He is in history. Merodach, Merodoch. Now he ruled in Babylon approximately 651 to 561 to 561 to 560. So he didn't rule very long, but he was there in the mix. And then we have Neriglisar. Neriglisar. I don't know how to pronounce it. And he was from about 559 to 556. And then there was another king who, Laboro, Sardoch. He ruled just in 556 for a few months. And then there was Nabonidus. And who was he? Nabonidus. Who was he? 555 to 539. Father of Belshazzar, right. So he was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. So we have these three people who ruled in the interim for a short period after Nebuchadnezzar died. And this is supposed to be, I've got a wrong date here. Yes, thank you very much for noticing that. 562. All right, somebody's awake out there. All right, so then we have Belshazzar, Belshazzar, and he ruled jointly with his father 553 to 539. And we know that Daniel was offered a third of the kingdom because we understand that he was ruling jointly with his father. So these are the dates here. These people here, Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, are the most important ones for us to note the dates. Now there are other possible scenarios for the dates, and I would like to share those with you some other time. But these are the traditional dates, and these are the ones you need to remember. Okay?
That long name, he just ruled from 556 till when?
He just ruled a few months.
Oh, yeah.
He probably they may have assassinated someone. I don't know all the history. And then finally, Nabonidus took over, because you can see from this period of 562 to 555, the 7-year period, there was some rather tumultuous time in the kingdom with changes of different people taking over. I'm sorry I don't know that history, but I just have these notes in the dates in my notes here. So we know that Babylon was kind of connected with Assyria. but eventually it threw off the Assyrian yoke, and it began to rule on its own. Now, when we talk about Babylon, where is Babylon itself? Pardon?
It's like,
And it's in Iraq today.
yeah, in Iraq today.
What does Mesopotamia mean? Anybody know? Mesopotamia.
Between
Between the rivers. Between which rivers?
the Euphrates
Euphrates
and
River Tigris, right?
Tigris.
Now, Babylon, if you look at Ur of the Chaldees, if you've looked at a map, Ur of the Chaldees is some miles, maybe 50, 60, 70 miles from where the Tigris and Euphrates meet. And they run approximately that same distance to the sea. So if you were to draw a map, you would see that the Tigris and the Euphrates run separately down, and then they join just before it comes into the sea here, the Adriatic Sea. So when you find Ur of the Chaldees is here somewhere, Babylon is here. So the distance between here and the sea and Ur of the Chaldees, this is Ur, and this is Babylon. And so this distance here is about the same. This is where Abraham came from. And of course, he went up here to Haran, and that's where he stayed for a while. So that distance is something like 600 miles or 1,000 kilometers that he traveled from Ur of the Chaldees. He probably passed through Babylon on the way. So sometime during his life, we assume, or was shortly after he was, or before he was born, sometime in the early part of his life, or before he was born, Babylon came under the judgment of God, and the things were divided. The languages were divided. So in this area down here in the Ur of Chaldees, there's a lot of marshes and reeds and so forth. This area is quite watered very well because of the two rivers coming together. So this is called the plain of Shinar also. So when we think of the image being set up here, set up on the plain, it's a very vast and large plain here. Many people could have gathered around the image in Daniel chapter 2, near the river. What? Plain of Dura, yeah. It's also called kind of the plain of Shinar. Later it is called the land of the Chaldeans. So it is thought to be the cradle of civilization. And many times I've read in different historical books that 3 different basic tribes entered into Babylonian language here within the Mesopotamian area. So it was inhabited by 3 different cultures. But the problem is they have it backwards. It was from this area that the basic 3 cultures went out. So historians turn things upside down sometimes. So as we understand it, the issue is that that's where it came from. So sometimes they call it the cradle of civilization. Sometimes they say it was inhabited by outsiders. We know that this area was watered like the Garden of Eden. And during the time in which Babylon and empire flourished, it was sustained it sustained a fairly dense population. How big was Babylon itself, the city? Do you know? It was approximately 15 miles on a side. So across the city it took about 15 miles to go across the city, and it was built with 3 walls around it. Each wall was able to support a chariot going around the wall. So it was quite a wall. And the river itself traveled twice the distance of the 15 miles. So within the city, the river went like 30 miles within the city, meandering. There is a hydraulic law that says any river that travels from point A to point B will travel twice as far as a straight line. That is a natural law of hydraulics. So you notice how rivers meander? They're going twice as far as a straight line between the 2 points. That is just part of geology. So that's what happened also in the area of Babylon. The Babylonian area had something like 200 square miles inside the city, if I understand correctly. Because if you take 15 times 15, how much is that? 20 square miles. I'm sorry, I was wrong. 20 square miles. No, that's wrong. 15 by 15 is how much? What's the square of 15 times 15? 225, right? So that's how many square miles, 200 square miles inside of Babylon. It was a pretty large city then. 15 square miles. It was huge, given ancient standards. Do you know of a city that's that big today? We have quite a few of them that are bigger than that today. But back then, that was a lot of area. So it was established by Nimrod originally, which we read already in Genesis chapter 10. It was located, of course, as we say, within an easy reach of the Persian Gulf. That's where this is, the Persian Gulf here, where the rivers run. It's an important city throughout history, but it was destroyed and rebuilt a number of times, but eventually it was destroyed and never built again. So during the time of Nebuchadnezzar from 605 to 562, it was the chief city in the world. It covered an area of about 200 square miles and had broad streets which were all laid out in perfect intersections at right angles. It had an imposing wall surrounded it and wide enough for chariots, as I said. It was beautiful, and it had hanging gardens. And why did Nebuchadnezzar build hanging gardens? For his wife. What was her name? Thank you. She he did it to please her because she was longing for her home, and he brought many of the things that she reminded her of home. In ancient history, we find a lot about Babylon. Later history of Babylon, it declined and may have still existed. My note says it may have existed in the New Testament times because 1 Peter 5:13 is to be taken literally. What does it say in 1 Peter 5:13? You know? Let's read it. Because my notes here, I don't know who said this, but they're wrong. Let's read 1 Peter 5:13. Because you see, we find in different places. Sorry, I didn't put this on silence. What does it say there about Babylon? Okay, what do we find now in Isaiah 13:19 through 21? What does it say there? First, Isaiah 13:19 through 21.
And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees' excellency, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It shall never be inhabited, neither shall it be dwelt in from generation to generation. Neither shall the Arabian pitch tent there, neither shall the shepherds make their fold there. But wild beasts of the desert shall lie there, and their houses shall be full of doleful creatures, and owls shall dwell there, and satyrs shall dance there.
So what does it say about Babylon?
It would never be inhabited again.
It would be destroyed. It would never be inhabited again. So in the time of Peter, we have to ask the question, was Peter speaking of a literal Babylon, or was he speaking of spiritual Babylon? I believe and I understand that Babylon was destroyed by this time, and that it was uninhabited. Therefore, when Peter's talking about Babylon in his epistle here, where is he writing from? Is he writing from literal Babylon or spiritual Babylon? I believe he's writing from spiritual Babylon. He's understanding that where he is in Rome is spiritual Babylon. So it came to symbolize in the book of Revelation the world in its wickedness. Fallen, fallen is great Babylon, we read in Old Testament as well as the New. So it was prophesied to be totally destroyed. Now, ancient Babylonian Empire. Since Babylon is regarded as the cradle of human civilization, it is therefore one of the most ancient of empires. About 2000 BC, Babylon was the dominating power in the world. Hammurabi. How many of you have heard of Hammurabi? You've heard of Hammurabi? What was he famous for?
The laws he made.
Laws, the laws that he wrote. He dealt with human rights, particularly women's rights and other things. And many people have said that he lived before Moses. And therefore Moses got his ideas from Hammurabi. I believe that Hammurabi lived contemporarily or even after Moses, because ancient history has been, they made these dates as long ago as possible. But I believe Hammurabi was a lot closer to the time of Moses and even after the time of Moses. And we have some evidence for that. So when you read these dates about Israel and especially Egypt and Babylon and so forth in modern writers, I want you to put in your mind that these dates have been manipulated to be as old as possible. And they are probably sometimes 300 to 500 to 700 years shorter than the modern archaeologists have put them. And I have some evidence for that, and this is not the class for it, but we can look at that in another time. So the following 1,000-year period of struggle, which saw no dominant power in that area, was controlled by different peoples. After Babylon was a dominating power at the beginning, it waned a little bit and then came back. Have you ever heard of the Hittites? For several hundred years, they didn't know there was such a thing. They believed the Bible was wrong about the Hittites. But in the last 50 years or so, they finally discovered and deciphered some writings that was not before discovered. And the Hittites now are proven to be a people that was a real people of the Bible. So we have the Kittites, the Elamites, of course the Assyrians ruled in that area for a time. This period was culminated about 300 years by the Assyrian power from 885 to 607, when Babylon finally broke its yoke with the Assyrians. So we have various Babylonian rulers which we have referred to. Now, Merodach-Baladan is mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 12. He tried to revolt against Assyria and made Babylon independent twice for a brief period. Now, this is not the same Merodach that we see on our wall here that we wrote on the board. This is Merodach-Baladan from 722 to 710 BC, about the time of the fall of Israel. So he is the one who visited Hezekiah, or he's the one who sent people to visit Hezekiah. Who did? Merodach-Baladan. And this was approximately, according to common knowledge, around 712 BC. Sargon II of Assyria, he crushed this rebellion of his son and his son Sennacherib. Have you heard of Sennacherib? What happened with Sennacherib? What did he do with Jerusalem when it rebelled under Hezekiah? He surrounded the city with how many troops? Remember what happened in the night? Remember the night, what happened, and the 3 lepers and all that, the story? the troops, 185,000 troops were killed around because of the destroying angel of the Lord. And Sennacherib went home, and Esarhaddon, the son of Sennacherib, took over in his place because Sennacherib went home and he was assassinated. You know, you come home without your troops, what would the people think? Pretty shameful homecoming, right? So they were ashamed of him, and I guess that was one of the reasons they assassinated him. But Sennacherib rebuilt Babylon and took Manasseh of Judah in about 687 captive to Babylon. Now, who was Manasseh? How long did he rule?
He was a ruler in the north kingdom of Israel, I believe.
He was a ruler in Judah. And he ruled 55 years, and he was very evil. And it was said that he's the one who had Isaiah sawn and sunder. Put him in a log and cut him in two. That's Jewish history. Manasseh did that. But interestingly, after most of his life, Manasseh repented. God gave him all that time, and he repented. And he accepted the Lord. So we actually believe and think, according to Scripture and according to history, that if we're faithful, we may see Manasseh in heaven, the murderer of Isaiah.
I guess Isaiah and Manasseh will probably have to see each other then.
What?
Isaiah and Manasseh will probably have to see each other.
Yeah, they'll have to talk to each other. Yeah, interesting. So his son was only given a few months to reign, and God didn't have much patience with him because he was also evil like his father, and God didn't see have any mercy for him. Now the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which we would call that under Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar, was from this period of 606 to 536. Actually, it goes back to the time of Nabopolassar in 625. Who was the viceroy of Babylon and rebelled against Assyria in 625. He established the independence of Babylon about this time, and along with Cyaxares the Mede, he conquered and destroyed Nineveh, the capital city of Assyria, about 612 BC. Nineveh, interesting. What happened in Nineveh that you remember? Jonah. When did Jonah go to Nineveh? Do you have any idea when he went to Nineveh?
That was a long time before it was destroyed.
But quite a while before it was destroyed. He said in 40 days God's going to destroy Nineveh. My personal opinion, if we ever find out, I'll probably be wrong, but my personal opinion that Jonah went there and he declared that Nineveh was going to be destroyed in 40 days. I believe it was destroyed, or the judgment came upon, final judgment, 40 years later. So if you go back 40 years before 612, you would come to 652. But most chronologers believe that Jonah was, and there's no date for Jonah, was about 680. That's the time that most chronologers give Jonah. In other words, another 70 years before Nineveh was destroyed. So he defeats the remnant of the Assyrian army at Haran. Where's Haran? Have you heard of Haran? Abraham went to Haran, but there are two Harans, and I don't know which one this is. I believe it's the same one where Abraham went in 610 BC. And how long ago or before this was Abraham there? Well, about 1,400 years before. Okay, so Abraham we can trace about 2,000, about that period, about 2,000 BC. So in 605, he and his son Nebuchadnezzar defeated an alliance of the Egyptians and what was left of the Assyrians at Carchemish, forever Indian Assyrian dominion. Actually, I believe this wasn't in 605. I believe it was more like 4 or 5 years earlier, but that's the common knowledge. Okay, I'm giving you what most people think, and I'm also telling you I have a different opinion about some of these dates. And we can look at why, like I said, at another time. Because we go and follow the chronology of Jeremiah and all those things, and I'd like to give you an assignment to look this up for yourself. And that would be a very interesting study guide to look at all the dates that the Bible gives to Nebuchadnezzar and how he defeated Egypt about, I think, somewhere around 609 or 610 BC. Okay, so his son Nebuchadnezzar defeated an alliance with the Egyptians, and this left Assyrian domination in the dust. So that's what happened to that. What happened? What did Assyria do about 100 years earlier? They took Israel captive, the 10 northern tribes, and spread them throughout their kingdom. So about 100 years later, that's what happened to them. The same thing that they did to the northern tribes, they were also dispersed, and Assyria passed into history. So Nebuchadnezzar, as we've said, was 605 to 652 BC, and he succeeded his father and was the empire's greatest king. He was a great conqueror and a great builder. He captured all the territory that had once been held by the king of Egypt from and for the third time in 586, when Jerusalem was destroyed. And of course, if you read the text carefully, Jerusalem was destroyed. Zedekiah was the last king. What does Zedekiah mean? Anybody have an idea? Zedekiah. Have you ever heard of Sadducees? Have you ever heard of Sadducees? Okay, this is all from the same root meaning righteousness. Kaya, Zedekiah, means the Lord our righteousness. Isn't that interesting? The last king of Israel was renamed by Nebuchadnezzar to mean the Lord our righteousness. In other words, he was naming him, now be good and be right. Do the right thing. But did he? No. He had the name, but he didn't do it. Do we have a lesson for us in this? We as the people of God in the last days have this name of the Lord our righteousness, but are we doing it? Are we being obedient to the prophet? No, many times we can say. So we need to consider this parallel in our day also. The prophet of that time, there was 3 of them actually. Who were they? Daniel, Ezekiel, and who was the primary prophet speaking to Zedekiah? Jeremiah. So we see that he also besieged Tyre. This took him 13 years to conquer Tyre. And Alexander the Great came back and finished that job. But very interesting statistics. To study the history of the prophecies of Tyre, many Bible preachers, Adventist preachers, have used the story of Tyre to show how God had promised that it would be a place for the fishermen to lay their nets. And it was a very powerful city and almost unconquerable. But Nebuchadnezzar conquered it, but it took him a long time. And it still wasn't fully done. Alexander the Great came back and finished it. He's the one who took up all the dust from Nineveh and built a causeway out there so his troops could go and finish the job of conquering Tyre. Yes?
That Alexander the Great conquered Tyre much quicker because he was the quickest of all,
Yes.
of all the kings to conquer the whole world.
That's what, if you want to find out what was in Nineveh, there's nothing left of Nineveh today because he took even the dust where Nineveh was. It was completely destroyed by Alexander the Great. He took every piece of rubble that was once the great Nineveh, and he made a road. He made a bridge, a water bridge, and he just poured it in the water, and now Tyre is no longer a little island. It's connected by this causeway that Alexander the Great made to get out to the city. Okay. So we can read about Sennacherib in Isaiah 36 and 2 Kings 19 and 2 Chronicles 33. This is where we find the story of Sennacherib and how he went home and in shame. So the gods of Babylon. Have you talked anything about the gods of Babylon? We talked a little bit, but we didn't go into any details. So let's talk a little bit about the gods of Babylon. These were basically the same as those of Assyria. Both nations were very superstitious. Marduk was their creator, and Ea, pronounced or spelled E-A, was the spirit of the water. The gods of the Babylonians were viewed as threats to them. They believed their gods always wanted to harm them. Ea was the only exception, since the sea brought trade and helped to make them rich. Of the evil gods, they said, door cannot shut them, nor bolt prevent them from entering. They glide like serpents beneath the door and creep through the joints of hinges like the puff of wind. So they believed in witches and demons and put hideous images to the right and the left of their doors of their houses to scare away the demons. They believed in the powers of the stars. Astrology had its birth in ancient Babylon. What do we have today that is a remnant of that? The 12 signs of the zodiac. So they had astrology. They thought they could tell the future from the stars. What's that called? Necromancy. Okay, where do we find that word? In Deuteronomy chapter 18. God pronounces what against that? It's an abomination to God. They built temples called ziggurats or step pyramids. Have you ever seen a step pyramid? Okay, these are called ziggurats. Woolley discovered Ur of the Chaldees, and that was in 1922 to 1926. He did a great archaeological dig there and found many things that were very interesting at Ur. They had inherited the idea from the ancient Sumerians about ziggurats. They consisted of towers with a number of stages, each one a little smaller than the other. They're called step pyramids. The most famous one was in the city of Babylon. It had 7 stages, each of which was different in color: black, orange, red, gold, pale yellow, deep blue, and silver. Each stage was dedicated to a different heavenly body: Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. Constant services were held at these temples. Many festivals were staged, highlighted by the New Year's festival. When was the New Year for the kings of ancient times? Do you have any idea when was the New Year? It says the kings at the beginning of the year went out to war. When was that? Well, it's the same basic time as Israel had. When was the New Year for Israel? Actually, they had 2. They had a secular calendar and a sacred calendar. When was the sacred calendar, the beginning of the sacred calendar?
I believe the secular was September.
Yes, very good. September, October. But when was the sacred
I think
calendar?
it was the spring, so March, April.
What do we call it today? Easter, Passover, right? That was the beginning of the Israelite year, sacred year. And it was the beginning of the kings in the Old Testament. When it says at the beginning of the year they went out to war, when was that? That was springtime. So when you read these things in Jeremiah, you need to understand what it means. The first time of the barley harvest after the full moon, after the new moon. So it tells us then that they had a New Year's festival which lasted 2 weeks and included, among other things, a procession of gods to Marduk's temple, the humiliation and restoration of the king, who later took the hand of Bel, B-E-L, to lead him in procession outside the city, where a reenactment of the assembly of the gods and the fixing of the fates for the ensuing year took place. We right now are at the time of the year in China of who? Of what? What is this year? Do you know? They have the year of the rat, the year of the dog, the year of the dragon. And so in China, this is believed to be a blessed time, the year of the dragon. Many women want to have their babies now. So China is going to have a baby boom this year, because the Chinese believe that this is the time to be born. You'll be luckier. You'll be more blessed if you're born in the year of the dragon. Now, when we think about China, the Chinese are of which tribe? Shem, Ham, or Japheth? Shem. Shem is also the tribe of Israel, right? So the Chinese are more related to Israel than is Ham or Japheth, or the black or the white race. So we can say that Israelites are oriental more. And there's a lot of culture, even in the language, the way that the language is developed and used is more Hebrew in its thinking and the way it's written than is any other language that I know of. So there's a lot of carryovers in Chinese that relate to Israel. So they also believed in a life after death. It was thought to be gloomy and dismal. They referred to the place they believed souls went to after death as the land of no return. Well, kind of true. I don't know if anybody has come back except one person who's really come back from the dead. We know people have been resurrected, but nobody's ever talked about what it was like on the other side when they came back. Do we have any evidence of anyone who was raised from the dead that talked about it? Only one person. Who's that person? Jesus Christ, right? He's the only one who's talked about life on the other side. So their religion seemed to have little influence on their conduct. So they believed that their religion was one thing and their life was something else. We have a little of that also in Greek culture. Socially, they could be as cruel as most of the conquering people of their day. They utterly burned and destroyed Jerusalem and many other walled cities. For example, King Zedekiah of Judah was captured before Nebuchadnezzar by Lachish, actually, and we know what happened. He was blinded after his sons were killed. So they did not glory in cruelty, though, the way the Assyrians had. They tended to leave people they conquered exactly where they found them as long as they accepted Babylonian rule. So they didn't do what the Assyrians did. That was to mix them and destroy them and bring in people from the outside. A submissive city would be left standing with only tribute to pay. Judah was defeated, her cities destroyed, and her people moved because she kept rebelling. Captive people were treated generously, like Daniel and his companions, and they were trained to serve the king's palace, given honorable positions in the Babylonian kingdom. The Jews, while in captive, were allowed to establish prosperous, comfortable colonies. They were located by the river Chebar. They irrigated the river, and they also, built their own houses and lived in them, farmed, and so forth. Jeremiah wrote a letter to the captives telling them to build houses and plant gardens, and so they also allowed their sons to marry and to prosper. Of course, that was a problem when they married the Babylonians. They married Babylonian women, and they came back to Jerusalem with them, and what did then Nehemiah and Ezra have to do? Had to have them put away these wives, because how could they pollute the priesthood? They had done things that was not permitted for a Jew to do, especially for a priest to do. This was incorrect. So many Jews became rich during this period. So politically, Nabopolassar was founded of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar was his son. And he was also that empire's greatest king, as we mentioned. He captured vast territories and many peoples and built Babylon into the most glorious city. It was called one of the seven wonders of the world. He was the only king to his time that had ever destroyed the temple of God. God would not allow him to drink or think that he was greater than the God of Israel, because we see what happened in his lifetime, how we've been studying how God humbled him. Now, Evil Merodach, which we have on our board here, or Amul Merodach, is mentioned in 2 Kings 25:27. He ruled from maybe a year or so, from 562 to 560. He was the son of Nebuchadnezzar and was assassinated by Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law, Nergal-Asser. Nergal-Asser ruled for about 4 years, and then Labish-Marduk, who was also the son of Nergal-Asser, he was deposed by a popular uprising. Nabonidus, he was a general under Nebuchadnezzar, and he was probably one of Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-laws. Belshazzar, the son of Nabonidus, grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, was appointed as co-reign with his father. Both he and his father ruled until the Medes and Persians conquered Babylon. So when does the time of this vision in Daniel chapter 7 take place? Near the beginning of the reign of Belshazzar, right about that time, right about the time that Belshazzar becomes king with his father, is the time of the vision of Daniel 7. So when did Daniel 6 take place? What was the date of Daniel 6? 530 something, right? 537, something like that. In the first year of King Darius, 536, somewhere in there. So when does this vision of Daniel chapter 7 take place? 553. What's the difference in the dates? How far apart were they? 553 to 537, what's the difference?
16 years.
About 15 years.
Yeah.
So we can say that this vision in Daniel chapter 7 takes place maybe 15 years before the fall of Babylon. So how old would Daniel be at this time of this dream?
In Daniel 7?
Yes, so he was maybe 16, let's say round it off, say 15.
At
And
that
this
time,
is
he was 67 at this time, I believe.
67.
Because he was 82 when when Belshazzar and Babylon fell in 539.
Okay, according to our reckoning, yeah, he was about that age. So, this may be a correct date, but I've read that he was like 110 when he died, according to some calculations. Anyway, that's another point which we can't go into. But here we find that Daniel was an old man, maybe in his 60s or later, and this is the time that we find the vision of Daniel chapter 7. Okay, we're going to take a look now at we're going to work through the book of, or the chapter 7 of Daniel, and we're going to look at that, and we'll take a break before we do, and so at this time, with our introduction past, we will give a little bit of a break to you, and then we'll go on and look at the chapter 7. Okay, we'll take a short break.